I'm just going to say what I'm going to say.
Okay.
This is a 2-hour trash-a-thon of our royal family, of the monarchy, of everything the Queen has worked so hard for.
At first glance, Meghan Markle's big pregnancy reveal looked straight out of a dreamy storybook. Soft lighting, her smile glowing, one hand on her belly, the other holding tight to Prince Harry's, it was pure perfection. The kind of image people expect from modern royalty. A duchess, a baby, a legacy reborn in flawless Instagram style. But soon after, something felt unusual. Not dramatic or wild, just subtle enough to make people raise an eyebrow. Royal watchers caught it before the media did. The bump looked different from one moment to the next, not fake, not impossible, just unpredictable. One week it seemed rounder, the next it looked smaller. At one event it sat high, and at another it appeared lower, sometimes only days apart. At first, her supporters rushed to defend her. They blamed it on angles, outfit choices, camera lenses, or how she stood, anything to explain the changing look. But it kept happening, and people couldn't help but talk. Screenshots spread online, and whispers turned into full-on debates. Curiosity was growing fast. What made it all more intense was the timing. Meghan had already shaken things up between her and the royal family. Her reputation and Harry's were both under heavy spotlight. Meanwhile, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had just reminded everyone what the royal routine usually looked like.
Harry and Meghan's big-budget Netflix series have so far been less than kind. Unimaginative and frustrating, said Hollywood's Bible Variety magazine. So sickening, I almost brought up my breakfast, said the woke Bible, The Guardian.
After giving birth, she stepped out of the Lindo wing looking calm and put together, baby in hand, cameras flashing. It wasn't about showing off, it was about keeping a steady royal tradition. Give birth, show the baby, and assure the public everything's okay. Meghan, though, was flipping the royal rule book and writing her own story. People close to her were buzzing about plans for a peaceful home birth. Frogmore Cottage was painted as her calm escape, a private, natural space far away from royal formality. It matched perfectly with the image she'd been building, modern, thoughtful, and fully in control of her journey. The public embraced it right away. Why wouldn't they? She made it clear she wasn't following the old royal playbook. Then came May 6, 2019, and just like that, everything shifted. No home birth, no serene moment at Frogmore. Meghan had her baby at the Portland Hospital in London instead. That choice alone wasn't shocking. It's completely safe. The twist wasn't the hospital, it was the silence. No one explained why the plan had changed. Not a statement, not even a short note saying it was for medical reasons. The story just flipped overnight, and the quiet that followed was deafening. When someone builds a public image centered on values like natural living, privacy, and independence, and the media's tracking their every move, people expect at least a small explanation when things take a sudden turn. But this time, there was nothing. The palace stayed silent, Meghan said nothing, and reporters were left guessing what really happened. That silence spoke volumes. Once people start feeling like the story's being tightly controlled instead of honestly shared, curiosity turns into suspicion fast, and the whispers start to sound a lot louder. And that's exactly when the internet did what it always does. It went digging deep. Old interviews were re-watched, public appearances were slowed down, zoomed in, and studied frame by frame. Social media filled up with side-by-side comparisons, all focused on one thing: the baby bump. In some clips, Meghan moved gently, sitting down with care.
Cottage like many had expected, but rather at a London hospital.
Even though Meghan had let it be known she wanted a home birth, it was probably very realistic that her first child at 37, it was going to be born in hospital.
The certificate lists the private luxury Portland hospital in Westminster.
Hands resting protectively around her belly. But in others, sometimes filmed just days apart, she walked upstairs smoothly, turned quickly, and seemed completely free in her movements. Sure, every pregnancy is different, no doubt about that, but the sudden differences in such a short time had people wondering. It wasn't about one awkward clip, it was a pattern that people couldn't ignore. She looked very far along in one moment, then surprisingly comfortable and unrestricted in another, especially when the cameras weren't right on her. Online discussions blew up, not with harsh comments at first, but with genuine questions. How could a bump appear to change so quickly? Were the dates lining up right? And why did everything feel so carefully controlled? The curiosity only grew stronger. Then came the post-birth delay. Instead of the usual royal photo call just hours after giving birth, Meghan and Harry waited 2 full days before showing baby Archie to the world. Privacy isn't an issue on its own. Everyone deserves that. But when it comes to royalty, traditions are tied to transparency. Break those traditions without saying why, and people start to think there's more going on behind the scenes. Critics weren't immediately attacking, they were asking. But those unanswered questions started spreading fast, and then came the real twist. Rumors of supposed internal documents began making rounds online, adding even more fuel to the growing mystery. There were claims of scheduling notes, appointment records, and timelines supposedly mapping out Meghan's movements during her pregnancy. If those papers were legit, they didn't just raise small questions, they clashed directly with the story the public had been told. One source even said, "This feels like a 2-hour takedown of the royal image and everything the Queen built." That's how intense the reaction was. According to what circulated online, there were hospital visits listed on days when Meghan had been photographed attending events across London. Not little overlaps, entire days that didn't seem to match. Whether true or not, the document sparked massive buzz. And here's the thing, no one confirmed them, but no one denied them either. They just sat there, unaddressed, floating around the internet. And when it comes to public opinion, silence doesn't calm things down, it makes them explode louder. Then came Piers Morgan, stepping in like a storm.
Meghan torched what little was left of their relationship with the royal family and what little was left, frankly, of their own reputations. Last week was mostly sycophantic.
Bold, outspoken, and clearly ready to make waves. He took the whole situation straight to the airwaves. He waved around papers, cited dates, replayed clips, and skipped the soft questions entirely. His claim was that the pregnancy story wasn't just lived, it was produced. The most shocking part of his claim was about the birth announcement. He said there were allegedly several drafts written before baby Archie was even born, each with different wording, dates, and details. To Morgan, that wasn't thoughtful planning, it was full-on branding. Who turns motherhood into a media rollout, he demanded on air. The outrage started to fade, and in its place came something heavier. Discomfort. People stopped saying this is unfair treatment and started asking why won't they just explain what happened. The famous Oprah interview was suddenly being watched again, this time under a whole new lens. Piers Morgan went all in, analyzing every pause, every near tear, every emotional beat. To him, it didn't look like raw emotion anymore. It looked rehearsed. Once an audience starts doubting someone's sincerity, everything changes. Every glance seemed timed, every pause planned. Too much control can make even real emotions look like part of a script.
And that's when the story really began to twist. This wasn't just ordinary gossip anymore. It felt deeper, more serious. It wasn't one claim or one picture stirring the pot. It was everything stacking up together. The changing timelines, the silence, the alleged documents, the carefully managed appearances, it all started chipping away at people's trust. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, spreading through quiet conversations and online debates. Once doubt takes hold, it's hard to erase. Trust, once cracked, rarely goes back to what it was. By the time whispers about the situation reached legal territory, things had gone way beyond tabloid chatter. It had entered the courtroom. And once something hits legal records, it's no longer just rumor, it becomes real risk. That's reportedly when Harry lost his cool, not in public, but behind the scenes. Late-night phone calls, tense meetings, worried faces among his team, it was clear the pressure was heavy. That moment when you realize you're no longer steering the ship, it hits hard. You're just bracing for impact, hoping the crash isn't as bad as it looks. The Daily Mail case was supposed to be straightforward. The press crossed a line, Harry stood up for his principles, and the courtroom would decide who was right. It was the perfect setup for him. The media had hurt his family before, and he wasn't about to let history repeat itself. But then the legal filings arrived, and buried inside all that formal language were lines that made his team freeze. Not accusations, not direct claims, but quiet references that raised eyebrows. Mentions of internal communications, hints about possible inconsistencies between private and public statements, and footnotes that didn't accuse but definitely didn't ignore either. It was like a field of legal traps just waiting to go off. Once a court even acknowledges there might be questions, those questions become open territory. And that means discovery, subpoenas, requests for records, verification of details, communication logs, the exact kind of personal information Harry had promised to keep off limits. This was the scenario he'd been dreading, the private life he fought to protect, now hanging by a legal thread. Inside his legal circle, tension cracked the air. Some advisors said, pull it back, keep the case narrow, stick to what's provable, and don't draw more attention. They wanted control and calm. Others disagreed completely, pushing to fight head-on, deny everything loudly, and take the battle straight to the public stage. Harry, though, was done with being cautious. He didn't just want control, he wanted victory. According to one insider, he slammed his hand on the table and said, "They don't get to question my family, ever." It wasn't a legal argument, it was a moral one, and that's the problem. Courts don't care about emotions, they care about what can be proven. And that was exactly the problem. Behind closed doors, the tension was reaching its peak. Every email was reread, every note rechecked, every timeline picked apart. The team went through old photos, comparing them to dates and official records, making sure every public appearance for Meghan's pregnancy lined up perfectly. What once seemed harmless suddenly looked risky. Every interview answer, every media quote, it all became potential evidence. Looking back, people started asking tough questions. Why had Meghan spoken so firmly about privacy, yet allowed certain media moments that seemed carefully chosen? Why turn down royal medical traditions but still use a private hospital tied to high-profile connections? Why share bits and pieces of information instead of one clear statement? On their own, these details didn't mean much, but together they gave off a sense of calculated control. And when control becomes the focus, people naturally start asking, what exactly is being controlled? The court's big reveal didn't come with drama or shouting. It arrived quietly through standard legal process, but its impact was huge. Suddenly, old comments from interviews resurfaced. Lines like, "The royal family wants me gone," or claims about emotional mistreatment. Then came the public backlash, with critics saying things like, "He's being manipulative," or "They're exaggerating their struggles." It was messy, emotional, and hard to separate from the actual facts. The judge didn't accuse anyone or make wild claims. He simply pointed out that there were inconsistencies between the public story and what was being presented in court. He didn't demand proof or expose private details, just clarification. But that simple request carried weight, and when context matters, explanations matter too. Reports say Harry went completely quiet. No yelling, no angry words, just a heavy, meaningful silence. This wasn't the media shouting anymore. This was the courtroom calmly asking for something simple: clarity. And clarity needs solid facts. That night, insiders said the atmosphere was tense. Harry was restless, pacing, running through every possible scenario in his mind: subpoenas, questioning, doctors being called in to confirm records. The thought of private matters being opened up in a courtroom made him uneasy. Meghan, on the other hand, stayed steady. She focused on message control, carefully shaping how their story would be seen and understood. That difference between them said everything. Harry believed in fighting back hard to protect his family. Meghan believed in protecting through control, by steering the story before it steered them. Those two instincts don't always fit together. Over the next few weeks, it was chaos behind the scenes. Plans kept changing, statements were written, rewritten, and then scrapped altogether. Advisors argued back and forth, some saying stay quiet and ride it out, while others pushed for a bold response right away. Public opinion started to shift too. The sympathy that once came easily was fading. Social media wasn't angry anymore, it was analytical. Supporters weren't shouting in defense, they were asking questions instead. And that's never a good sign for any public figure. Meanwhile, the press could sense something was off, not because they had solid evidence, but because the royal silence broke every pattern. This was a couple known for speaking up quickly, responding to rumors, correcting headlines, firing back when needed. What shook Harry most wasn't the fear of the truth coming out, it was losing control. For the first time, the story wasn't his to shape or defend. The narrative had slipped into the hands of legal timelines, court filings, and outside voices who didn't care about image or legacy. They only cared about accuracy. That shift hit hard. Behind the scenes, reports surfaced of tense moments with his advisors. Conversations got heated. Harry allegedly accused some of being too cautious, too slow to act. He argued that addressing rumors would only make them bigger, but maybe he realized too late that waiting in silence can do even more damage, because the longer you wait to explain, the more people fill in the blanks themselves. The confusion spreads quietly, stacking up until it becomes impossible to contain.
Meanwhile, the legal paperwork kept coming, one filing after another. Each document added pressure, and each clarification request made things feel tighter and more serious. The irony was hard to ignore. Harry had gone to court to expose how the press twisted stories, but now it was the court dissecting his version of events. No accusations, just careful, steady questioning. And that calm, methodical tone made it sting even more. By the next hearing, the damage had quietly grown. Trust hadn't fully collapsed, but it had thinned out even among people who once supported him. Neutral voices began asking, why not just clear things up? That question followed him everywhere. But clearing things up wasn't simple. It meant opening doors he had locked tight for years. It meant revealing details he had fought to keep private and inviting scrutiny straight into his home life. And the hardest part? It meant giving up control, the very thing he'd built his identity around since stepping back from royal life. For Harry, that wasn't just uncomfortable, it was devastating. This had stopped being about one lawsuit. It was now about whether their story could survive being fact-checked in full light, and whether silence, their most trusted shield, had turned into something that cut both ways. No one wanted to say it out loud, but cracks were starting to show in Harry's calm exterior. The courtroom wasn't asking what happened anymore, it was asking when.
And that's the most dangerous question of all. When turns feelings into timelines, it turns emotion into cold, hard evidence. When stories have to line up side by side, every word, every date, every small detail suddenly matters. It's no longer emotional, it's exact. And precision can be brutal. The real issue wasn't one big contradiction. It was the slow buildup of little ones. A quote here that didn't quite match a photo there. A confident public statement that sounded solid until someone compared it with another one from months before. The differences were small but noticeable. Not outright lies, just stories adjusted for different moments and audiences. But courts don't like that. They want consistency, not storytelling. As preparations for the next stage of the case began, Harry got a warning. It was time to be ready for possible witness testimony. Maybe not his own right away, but from others around him. Medical staff, security teams, communication aides, people who'd always worked quietly in the background. Now they were being brought into the open, their words suddenly carrying weight. Even confidentiality agreements couldn't block everything. People can be legally required to talk, and memories can't be erased. Once a court steps in, silence isn't a choice, it's a legal question. And that's when Harry's frustration deepened. He didn't feel surrounded by enemies, he felt surrounded by uncertainty. Who knew what? Who had said what? Which conversations had been written down and which ones lived only in memory? Then, in one tense meeting, Harry shocked his team with a single question. Who else could be called to testify? The room went quiet. They started listing names, people who'd never expected to step into the spotlight. That night, the tension finally spilled over, not in shouting, but in cold, controlled silence. Meghan repeated her stance clearly. Hold the line. Don't react. Don't expand. And don't let emotion steer the case. She reminded everyone that this battle was supposed to be about press misconduct, not private life. Bringing personal matters into it would only spark more talk. But Harry couldn't agree. He'd learned the hard way that ignoring speculation doesn't make it disappear. It grows louder when left unanswered. He still believed that a strong, honest statement could put an end to the noise. But to make a statement that bold, you need solid, provable facts. And once you go public with facts, there's no taking them back. That was the standoff between them. Her strategy versus his instinct. As the days went by, it started to show. At public events, Harry tried to project calm, but his body language told a different story. He looked tense, distracted, like someone fighting a battle behind the scenes that wasn't going to plan. The press picked up on it fast, and headlines started reading between the lines. Then came a small legal update that most people overlooked, but inside the courtroom, it landed hard. 3 quiet words: material relevance. Simple legal phrasing, but packed with meaning. It signaled that the court now considered personal details connected to the case's credibility. And once credibility becomes part of the equation, private doors start creaking open, doors that are nearly impossible to shut again. According to insiders, that's when Harry asked a question that stunned his own team. Can we just drop the case? Technically, yes, they told him, he could. But even if he did, everything already filed would stay on record. The references, the mentions, the context, it would all remain part of the legal trail. And worse, pulling out suddenly would spark new rumors. Why stop now? Why step back when the whole world's watching? In the middle of scrutiny, walking away can look a lot like surrender. And Harry had never been someone who surrenders easily. But as his frustration grew, Meghan's approach only became sharper. She turned her focus outward, public appearances tied to charity work, selective projects with powerful messaging, all spotlighting strength and purpose. Her shield wasn't silence, it was momentum. Keep moving forward, stay seen, stay composed, and rise above the noise. But the real noise wasn't coming from the tabloids anymore. It was echoing inside the courtroom.
Behind closed doors, lawyers argued endlessly about how to respond without revealing too much. How do you clarify without creating new openings? How do you answer questions without confirming what shouldn't be confirmed? Legal phrasing became an art form of its own. Phrases like, "We do not accept that characterization," and "there is no basis to infer," filled the documents. Precise, professional, but so careful they sounded almost evasive. Harry couldn't stand it. He wanted strength, not subtlety. He wanted a statement that felt final, a firm line in the sand. But even solid ground can crack when pressure keeps building. Meanwhile, the judge's patience began wearing thin, not necessarily with the couple, but with the constant fog around the case. Courts don't like confusion. They value progress. They don't want to keep circling the same unclear details over and over. And the more the court sensed that clarity was being avoided, the closer it looked. It wasn't personal, it was process, but that didn't make it any easier to take. In those quiet moments away from the cameras, Harry found himself replaying old memories. Decisions made, conversations had, crossroads where things could have gone differently. Then it hit him, the realization that changed everything. How much of their life had been curated, not just protected. Sitting in silence, Harry began to wonder if his instinct to shield his family had at times crossed into something else, not deception, but selective omission. And in a courtroom, omission is still a decision. That thought weighed heavy. As the third phase of the case wrapped up, it stood at a turning point. The story could go one of two ways: stay narrow and focused only on the press's actions, or widen, pulling personal history into the open for everyone to see. Neither path was clean. Both carried risk. The press stayed on standby, waiting for the next headline. The public speculated endlessly. Even supporters were split. Was this about protecting privacy or controlling it? Harry found himself trapped between two worlds. He'd stepped into court to shield his family from intrusion, but now the court was asking him to define those very boundaries. And for the first time, he didn't know where the line truly was. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the atmosphere was thick, charged, almost electric. Everyone involved could feel it. Whatever was coming next wouldn't be controlled by spin, image, or influence. It would be determined by process, and process has no pause button. Once it starts, it runs its course, no matter who wants peace. By the time the final stage of the case arrived, the illusion of control was gone. What began as a battle against unfair press tactics had turned into something deeper and far more unsettling. It wasn't about bad headlines anymore. It was about credibility itself. Every piece of the public image they'd built, every polished statement, every careful message, every rehearsed pause was now under cold clinical examination. There was no drama, no shouting from tabloids this time. Just quiet, precise questions typed into legal documents. Questions that didn't mock or accuse, but cut straight through the surface, leaving no room for interpretation, no space for performance, and no shelter in carefully crafted stories. The court's questions weren't emotional. They were simple, precise, and focused on one thing: alignment. And alignment was exactly what no longer existed. The tipping point didn't come with a scandal or a headline. It arrived quietly, tucked inside a routine court order asking for one thing: clarification. No leaks, no breaking news, just calm, polite wording that carried enormous weight. Each phrase from the court felt heavier than a dozen media cycles. Every sentence was deliberate, every word chosen with care. But behind that politeness sat power, the kind that doesn't yell, it just waits for your answer. And that's what haunted Harry most, that single word: clarify. Clarification meant no more multiple versions of the story, no more rephrasing or reshaping.
It meant locking one version of events into place, one that could be questioned, analyzed, and remembered forever. It meant giving up the flexibility they had relied on for years, the ability to adjust tone, to pause, to add nuance when the pressure rose. Once the court record was written, there would be no context later, no softening the edges. Every statement would stand as is, frozen in time. That night when the notice arrived, Harry couldn't rest. He didn't explode in anger, he just moved restlessly, pacing for hours, thinking, analyzing. He played old moments back in his mind, the interviews, the documentaries, even casual conversations that once felt harmless. Not just his own words, but Meghan's too. This time he heard them differently, not emotionally, but structurally, the way a judge or lawyer might. Where did they speak in absolutes? Where did they hesitate? When did qualifiers disappear? Those tiny shifts suddenly felt huge. Even the smallest details, pauses, tone, emphasis, now carried weight. Every nod, every phrase that once seemed natural, now looked like evidence waiting to be dissected. None of it had felt risky back then. They were just telling their story. But now, after being retold so many times, those same stories had started to echo, and each echo carried a slightly different note. Meghan, on her side, stayed calm, composed in a way that almost seemed effortless. She always understood the power of storytelling better than anyone. To her, stories weren't fixed. They were living, breathing things that shifted with time and circumstance. She believed what mattered most wasn't getting every detail exact, but keeping the intention true. And her intentions, she felt, had always come from an honest place. But courtrooms don't deal in intention. They deal in evidence. In that cold, precise world of legal process, nuance doesn't survive for long. Once it's written down, it's stripped of emotion and open to endless interpretation. The tension between Harry and Meghan didn't explode into arguments. It didn't need to. It showed up in quieter ways, in the silences between them, in the decisions that got delayed again and again, in long glances that said everything words couldn't, in those small phrases like, "Let's talk about this tomorrow," that somehow never turned into tomorrow. For Harry, a deeper realization began to take shape, one that shook him more than the court's questions ever could. They weren't fighting the same battle anymore. He was fighting to rebuild trust, to prove sincerity, to clear his name. She was fighting to maintain control, to protect the narrative, the image, the version of events that kept everything intact. Neither motive was wrong, but they were pulling in opposite directions. And of course, the press picked up on it. They always do. The tone of coverage began to shift subtly but sharply. The old sensational headlines started to fade, replaced by analytical ones. Less drama, more dissection. The old narrative of hero and villain gave way to something colder: analysis, timelines, quiet comparisons. The change was almost invisible at first, but its impact was brutal. Every story Harry had built in his head, every plea for understanding, every speech crafted to win sympathy, was now being examined piece by piece, not for emotion, but for accuracy. The spotlight had moved away from how the story felt and turned toward how it fit together. It was the kind of attention that peeled away every bit of drama's protection. Suddenly, there was nothing left to hide behind. Supporters noticed the shift right away. Some doubled down, standing by Harry and Meghan with fierce loyalty, defending every decision and every silence. They insisted that no one owed the public detailed medical updates or personal explanations. But not everyone felt as sure anymore. Some fans grew quieter, less outspoken, not angry, just uncertain, and hesitation for public figures can be dangerous. It signals that the trust, once solid, is starting to soften. The final hearing loomed like a storm on the edge of the horizon, always visible, never quite moving closer, but never going away. Every decision felt heavy and permanent. If they withdrew, it could look evasive.
If they continued, it risked deeper exposure. If they clarified, the story would be locked forever in legal record. If they stayed silent, others would define it for them. Every choice had a cost, and Harry felt the walls closing in. He once believed these choices gave him control, but now they all looked like traps. Each moment of reflection uncovered new risks, new ways the truth could twist. In one quiet, private moment, one that no one recorded or leaked, Harry finally admitted to himself he was tired. Not just of the critics, not even of the press, but of the constant maintenance of the story. The never-ending effort to manage what was said, what was implied, and what must never be touched.
He started to wonder, when had protecting privacy turned into protecting ambiguity? The two had blended so completely he couldn't tell the difference anymore. The emotional tone that once made their story so captivating was gone, stripped away and replaced with a level of neutrality so sharp it felt almost unnatural. Yet beneath that calm surface, the tension hadn't disappeared. It had only settled deeper. The court didn't need to blow the story wide open. It did something more powerful. It narrowed it down. Piece by piece, the noise and emotion were peeled away until only the essentials remained. No headlines, no public drama, just facts under a microscope. By doing that, the court quietly confirmed what everyone had already begun to realize. This wasn't just about the press anymore. It was about consistency, about whether the story itself could stand without the protection of emotion. When the ruling finally came, it was cautious, deliberate, neither the sweeping victory Harry had once hoped for, nor the defeat critics had predicted. It was somewhere in between, a mixed outcome. Some of his claims stood, others fell. The language was professional but pointed, praising certain arguments while gently undermining others. The gray areas remained, and gray areas always linger. But the real story wasn't in the judgment, it was in what happened next. For the first time, Harry didn't rush to defend or explain. There was no speech, no quick interview, no finely tuned statement crafted to win back the narrative. He stayed silent, and not because it was strategy, but because he had nothing left to add. The words had run their course. A clip began circulating online, echoing public sentiment. You can't say you don't want attention and then turn around and write a whole book about not wanting attention. It summed up the exhaustion people felt with the back and forth. But this time, Harry didn't respond. He let it pass. Meghan, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had changed. She kept to her schedule, continued her projects, stayed poised and composed in every appearance. If she felt the shift in tone, she didn't show it. Her calm had become armor, polished, unshaken, untouchable. Meghan had always believed that the best way to face pressure was to keep moving forward, momentum as a shield. Keep busy, stay visible, and don't give scrutiny a place to settle. But Harry wasn't so sure anymore. Something in him had shifted. Slowly, quietly, he began stepping back, not disappearing from public life, but sliding away from its center. Fewer appearances, fewer statements, less commentary. The change was subtle, the kind only those paying close attention could see. It wasn't retreat, it was reflection. The media, as always, moved on to the next story, but the shadow of what had unfolded didn't fade. It lingered. Not quite scandal, not quite redemption, just a sense that something deep beneath the surface had changed forever. The once solid narrative, the one presented with complete certainty, now had softer edges, and soft edges invite reinterpretation. In the years that would follow, analysts and historians would dissect this chapter endlessly. Was it mismanaged, overblown, or simply the natural clash between modern celebrity, relentless media, and an ancient institution that was never built for transparency? Probably all of it. A collision of image, truth, and control. But for Harry, the lesson cut deeper and simpler. You can fight intrusion.
you can fight false stories, you can even stand up against entire institutions. But the moment your own story becomes the battlefield, every victory costs something, and every loss feels personal. Because the moment your life turns into public evidence, the price of defending it never really ends. And in the end, there was no dramatic downfall, no explosive truth-telling, no grand revelation that left the world stunned. Reality was quieter and far more human. It wasn't chaos that followed, it was erosion, a slow fading of absolute certainty, of unquestioned trust, of the belief that careful control could ever fully protect truth. Harry didn't break down or lash out, no matter how the headlines tried to paint him. The reaction was quieter than that. He just stopped trying to prove the story right or wrong. Harry didn't break down or lash out. His moment of realization came quietly, deep inside. He finally understood that the battle he thought he was still fighting had already changed shape long ago. Some wars don't end with victory or defeat, they just fade into legacy. And legacy, unlike a headline, can't be managed, edited, or spun. It simply exists, shaping how the story is remembered long after the noise dies down. In the months that followed, the chaos didn't vanish. It just softened into a quiet, persistent hum, the kind that hides underneath everything. Interviews, public speeches, photo ops, even the perfectly practiced smiles. Harry could still hear it, the low buzz of judgment and curiosity that never really went away. He learned to recognize it, especially when no one else seemed to notice. What caught him off guard wasn't the criticism, that was familiar. It was the shift in expectation. People no longer leaned in to hear what he'd say next, hoping to be convinced. Instead, they leaned back, listening not for emotion, but for consistency. That subtle shift changed everything. Once people start measuring you for truth instead of empathy, every word you say lands differently. Meanwhile, Meghan kept moving forward with precision. New projects, polished appearances, and carefully measured words filled her calendar. Her tone stayed calm, confident, empathetic, steady as ever. To the public, she looked unchanged, untouched by the tension. But to Harry, she looked laser-focused, locked on the next goal, the next horizon. He admired that about her. He always had. But even admiration couldn't quiet the feeling that something between them had started to fall out of sync. Late one evening, when the house was silent and the cameras long gone, Harry sat alone with a pile of notes, statements, clarifications, talking points that would never see the light of day. Pages and pages meant to defend, explain, and justify. And in that quiet moment, he realized something huge. He didn't need them anymore.
He had spent years preparing to explain a story that no longer needed explaining, because the world had already made up its mind. The audience had decided how much uncertainty they were willing to accept, and once the world decides that, no statement can change it. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about ambiguity. And once ambiguity is out in the open, it changes how every future word is heard. Nothing sounds the same again. Harry didn't feel angry. He felt something quieter, acceptance. Not surrender, not defeat, just an understanding of limits. The limits of truth, of control, of trying to manage how the world interprets your life. He began to see that some stories, when stretched too far to protect what's personal, end up bending under their own weight. You start trying to shield your heart, and somewhere along the way you strain your backbone. It's not dishonesty, it's the wear and tear of trying too hard to hold everything together. The public, as always, moved on. They found new stories to chase, new faces to celebrate or criticize, but this one left behind a trace, a subtle mark like a watermark under light. You couldn't see it unless you looked closely, but once you did, it was impossible to unsee.
After that, Harry stepped onto quieter ground, not hiding, just living with more purpose. He stopped trying to correct every misquote or set the record straight with every rumor. He stopped bracing for impact every time his name appeared in a headline. Instead, he focused on work that spoke for itself, projects that didn't need public approval or belief to have meaning. And then something surprising happened. The silence he had once feared so much began to feel real. Not a tactic, not a shield, just honest. It became a kind of peace. Meghan noticed the shift immediately. She always noticed. Their conversations changed too. Not dramatic, not heated, just careful, like handling something fragile but worth protecting. They both wanted to keep what mattered most between them intact. Love didn't vanish, it adapted. That's what love does when it's tested by pressure. It reshapes, it adjusts, it finds new balance. The world would keep arguing about what really happened, what didn't, and what mattered most. But for Harry, that was okay. Maybe that uncertainty was the closest thing to truth anyone could ever get. Certainty, he realized, had been the illusion all along, and finally, letting go of it didn't feel like loss. What was left in the end wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, grounded, and harder to fake. It was about learning how to live without needing the story to land perfectly every time. Years from now, people will look back on this chapter and debate it endlessly, arguing over motives, timing, tone, and every detail caught on camera or written in a file. They'll study interviews like clues, dissect moments like artifacts from a culture addicted to visibility. But for Harry, the memory won't be about controversy. It'll be about understanding. The moment he finally saw that control isn't the same as clarity, and that trying to hold every piece together can sometimes make you lose sight of what's real. The most powerful realization didn't come with a public statement or a breaking headline. It came quietly from within. That was the real snap. Not an explosion, but an internal shift. The moment he stopped fighting to protect the perfect version of the story and accepted the one that simply is, unfinished, flawed, human, and for the first time in years, truly his own. If this deep dive into the quiet battles behind royal headlines got you thinking, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Drop a comment below and tell us your thoughts. Was this story about media pressure, control, or something deeper about what it means to live under constant spotlight? Let's talk about the struggles behind the silence, the choices made in public view, and the cost of protecting your truth in a world that never stops watching.